An officer laughs at a veteran's obsolete badge, moments before the Pentagon calls to reinstate him live on radio. Imagine serving your country in the most elite forces, facing danger, loss, and sacrifice, and then being dismissed, forgotten, even laughed at because your badge is called obsolete. This is the story of Walter Hayes, a veteran who lived quietly in the shadows, until one day everything changed in a moment that shook his world. Moments after an officer publicly mocked him, the Pentagon called, live on the radio, to reinstate him, restoring the honor he had earned long ago. You'll witness the quiet strength of a man who never sought recognition, but deserved it all along. And before I forget, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. I guarantee you won't want to miss it. Now let's jump in. The morning sun cast long, golden streaks across the quiet streets of Fairview, a small town that hardly ever made the news. Its courthouse, a modest brick building with a fading flag atop its pole, was already bustling with routine traffic citations and civil hearings. Inside, near the corner of the courtroom, sat Walter Hayes. He was a man most people passed without a second thought, a figure in his late 60s, wearing worn jeans, an old brown leather jacket with frayed cuffs, and boots that had seen more than their share of miles. His silver hair was cropped short, not out of vanity, but habit. His eyes, though soft and weathered, carried a distant sharpness, a depth that few ever noticed. Walter's hands rested quietly on his lap, calloused, strong, the knuckles slightly swollen from age. Hanging from a simple leather cord around his neck was an old military badge, an insignia that time had dulled, the edges chipped, the metal tarnished. Most wouldn't even recognize it, but it meant everything to him. It wasn't for display. It wasn't for conversation. It simply was a part of him, as immovable as the years he could never get back. Walter had come to the courthouse for a simple matter, a parking dispute that spiraled after a young officer had towed his truck without warning. Walter didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He simply came to resolve it. But the officer, Patrolman Bryce Holden, made it personal. Bryce was young, ambitious, with the confident swagger of someone who had never really been tested. His uniform was pristine, his radio clipped high on his chest, and his sidearm sat heavy on his belt, barely used. He had something to prove, and Walter, quiet, alone, and visibly past his prime, was an easy target. When Bryce called out Walter's name in the crowded courtroom, his tone was curt, bordering on dismissive. "You brought that old thing with you?" Bryce sneered, eyeing the badge around Walter's neck as he shuffled forward. "Looks like something out of a history book." Walter said nothing. He simply stood, his gait steady, if a bit stiff from old wounds. Bryce laughed again, this time louder, gesturing toward the badge. "You know that's not worth anything anymore, right? Pentagon phased those out decades ago. Obsolete, just like you." The words weren't just an insult. They were a dismissal, a stripping away of decades, of sacrifice, reduced to a punchline. Walter's jaw tensed, but he didn't flinch. He didn't answer. He just met Bryce's eyes with the quiet patience of a man who had seen the world from angles Bryce couldn't begin to imagine. Around them, people barely noticed. A few chuckled. Some whispered. Most simply waited for the next case. But across the room, seated in the back, a court clerk named Emma, who'd seen Walter visit the courthouse before, frowned deeply. There was something about him that never sat right with the labels people threw his way. That badge, old, worn, dismissed, wasn't just metal. And soon, the world would remember exactly what it meant. The hearing was procedural, almost mechanical. Bryce rattled off the details, the supposed infraction, the towing fee, the fine. His voice was sharp, rehearsed, his posture overly rigid, as if he were performing for the small crowd rather than simply doing his job. Walter answered in measured words, his tone level, his eyes steady. He wasn't interested in arguments. He wasn't here to defend his pride. He was here to resolve a mistake. But Bryce kept pushing. "You know," Bryce said, leaning forward just enough to let his words cut a little deeper. "We've got real officers working the streets now. People with modern training. Up-to-date protocols. Not guys clinging to dusty relics and badges from the Stone Age." Walter simply handed over the paperwork, the tip of his finger grazing the tarnished edge of his badge as he did. The contact was subtle, but the weight of it seemed to ground him. The judge, bored and moving the docket along, sided with Walter after reviewing the documents. The parking signs had indeed been poorly marked. The fine was dismissed. Case closed. But the damage wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the quiet humiliation, the public stripping of respect. As Walter turned to leave, Bryce smirked and tossed one final parting shot. Might want to get a new badge, old man. No one salutes ghosts. Walter paused in the doorway. For the briefest second, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, not bitterness, just memory. And then he was gone. Out on the courthouse steps, Walter adjusted the leather cord around his neck and walked toward his truck, his pace unhurried. The courthouse behind him returned to its rhythm. No one followed. No one cared. Except for Emma. She stood by the window, watching him cross the street. There was something familiar about that badge. She'd seen it once before, framed in her late father's study, in a photograph surrounded by medals he never spoke about. Emma's father, Colonel Richard Hale, had always carried a certain reverence for those badges, even when they'd fallen out of circulation. He called them the marks of the forgotten wars, insignias that weren't in the public consciousness anymore, but still carried blood, grit, and stories too heavy to retell. That night, after her shift, Emma went home and pulled the old photo album from her closet. She flipped through worn pages until she found the picture. Her father, much younger, stood shoulder to shoulder with a man in desert fatigues. His name tag read, Hayes. Her heart skipped. She grabbed the phone, fingers trembling slightly as she dialed an old friend of her father's, a retired commander who'd attended his funeral. When he answered, Emma wasted no time. "Commander, I need to ask you about someone. Do you remember a Walter Hayes?" The line went silent. She heard the man's breath hitch on the other end, as if she'd spoken the name of a ghost. "Hayes," the commander whispered. "You found him." "I think so," Emma said softly. The commander's voice firmed, a quiet awe woven through his words. "You have no idea who you're standing next to." And neither did Patrolman Bryce Holden. But he was about to find out. Emma couldn't sleep that night. Her mind circled the weight of the conversation, the gravity in the commander's voice still pressing on her chest. When she asked him who Walter Hayes was, the answer wasn't a story, it was a pause. A silence so heavy it spoke louder than words. "Hayes," the commander finally said, his voice distant, reverent, "was the ghost we sent in when things had already gone to hell. He wasn't a man who fought battles, he ended them. Quietly. Precisely. Without ever asking for a thank you." Emma pressed further, her curiosity turning sharp. "But the badge, he was Special Operations, right? Delta? Navy SEAL?" Another pause. "No, he was deeper than that. Hayes was part of a compartmentalized unit. Off the books. Above our clearance. Those badges were never issued in volume. Only to men like him. Most people don't even know what they are anymore." Emma's breath caught in her throat. What happened to his unit? There was a long, weary sigh on the other end. They buried the name. Disbanded the group. Quietly erased them from records. Some of those men disappeared. Some retired. Most didn't make it. And Hayes, we heard he walked away after something went wrong. Never sought recognition. Never came back. Emma sat in that silence, realizing the weight of what she'd witnessed in that courtroom. Bryce hadn't laughed at an old man. He'd laughed at a monument. And the worst part, Walter didn't even defend himself. The next morning, Emma drove to the town archives, combing through public records, old newspapers, anything she could find. Walter's name appeared just a handful of times: property deeds, vehicle registration, a fishing license. But tucked away in a forgotten box was a decades-old clipping, a grainy photo of a younger Walter Hayes standing at a military funeral. The headline read, "Local Soldier Returns After Tragedy Abroad." The article was brief, emotionless, clinical. It mentioned a covert operation gone wrong, the loss of his entire unit, and his subsequent honorable discharge. There was no ceremony, no medals, no parade, just a man sent home to vanish. Emma's chest tightened. The pieces slowly fit together. The weight in his eyes, the quiet way he moved through town, the badge he wore not for pride, but because it was the last thing that tethered him to men no one remembered. Meanwhile, Bryce Holden continued his routine without a second thought. He told the story of the old man with the worthless badge over coffee at the station, laughing, embellishing the moment, gaining the amused nods of his colleagues. To Bryce, Walter Hayes was nothing more than a story to pass the time. But stories can travel, especially when someone's listening. And one listener was all it would take to set everything in motion. That listener was Emma, and she wasn't about to let Walter Hayes fade into silence. Emma sat at her kitchen table, the morning sun filtering through lace curtains, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The weight of what she discovered pressed on her like a stone. She stared at the contact the retired commander had given her, a direct line to a Pentagon liaison, marked as inactive but monitored. She hesitated. Was she about to meddle in something she didn't understand? Maybe Walter wanted to be left alone. Maybe some stories were buried for a reason. But then she remembered the look on his face in the courtroom. Not anger, not indignation, resignation, as if he had accepted long ago that his story would end in silence. She couldn't let that happen. Her thumb hovered for a beat longer before she tapped the number. The line clicked once, twice, then connected. She expected voicemail. Instead, a calm, professional voice answered. Office of Veteran Affairs, Special Clearance Liaison. Please state your business. Emma's throat tightened, but she pushed through. I think I've located a Walter Hayes. Badge number. She rattled off the number etched on the tarnished metal, a detail she'd memorized the night before. The silence on the other end wasn't casual. It was immediate. Still, please hold. The line went dead for several seconds. Emma's pulse hammered in her ears. When the voice returned, it was sharper, more formal. Where did you see this man? I work at the Fairview Courthouse. He came in yesterday. I saw the way he was treated. I think people here don't know who he is. Another pause. Then the voice lowered. Miss, I need you to listen carefully. That badge doesn't exist on public records anymore. Anyone still carrying it is either presumed dead or is Walter Hayes. Emma's breath caught. We've been trying to confirm his status for years, the voice continued. He walked away from all contact. Never debriefed. We assumed he didn't want to be found. Emma's voice trembled. Why him? Why now? The agent's response was measured but unmistakably urgent. There are operational gaps. Emerging situations where his clearance and unique expertise are suddenly relevant again. The Pentagon has standing orders to reinstate him immediately if confirmed alive. No ceremony. No process. Just direct reinstatement. On his terms. Emma sat back, overwhelmed. The man they had laughed at in that courtroom wasn't just a veteran. He was a keystone in operations most people would never hear about. The agent's tone softened. Miss, may I ask, what made you notice him? Emma swallowed hard. Because he didn't try to prove anything. He just carried the weight. Quietly. And because no one else did. There was a pause. Then the agent said quietly, the call is coming. And when it does, the whole room will hear it. Before Emma could respond, the line disconnected. Across town, Walter sat in his truck, the radio softly humming through static. And on that frequency, a call was already searching for him. Walter's truck was more than transportation. It was a companion. The dashboard cracked, the paint faded, the bench seat worn smooth by time. In the glove box, tucked beneath a frayed map and old fishing permits, sat a small radio unit. Military grade, long range, patched into frequencies most civilians wouldn't even think to monitor. He didn't power it on much these days. There hadn't been a message for him in decades. But that morning, as the town came to life around him, something compelled Walter to reach over and twist the dial. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like instinct, muscle memory. His fingers moved without thinking, adjusting the frequency with the precision of a man who'd done it 1,000 times before. Static, more static. Then, cutting through the white noise, a voice. Whiskey Hotel 2, this is Command Actual. Do you copy? The call sign was his. It hadn't been spoken aloud in over 30 years. Walter's thumb hesitated over the receiver. His breath steady, but his heart, a heart that had weathered firefights, loss, betrayal, tightened. He said nothing. Whiskey Hotel 2, this is Command Actual. Acknowledge receipt. The voice was clear, calm, unmistakably official. Walter reached forward and turned the dial again, off. He sat there in the silence, his hand still resting on the knob, staring through the windshield as if the empty road ahead might offer some answer. His life here in Fairview was small, quiet, predictable, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But the past wasn't finished with him. In the distance, he heard the faint echo of the radio's return frequency clicking on again, persistent. Inside the courthouse, Bryce Holden was wrapping up his shift, his mind far from Walter Hayes. He'd recounted the story of the old man with the worthless badge enough times now that it had become a joke among his fellow officers. But as Bryce stepped outside, a call crackled over his own police radio. "Attention all units. Courthouse frequency patch requested for a direct Pentagon communication. Stand by for federal override." Bryce frowned. He'd never heard that kind of transmission come through their local channel before. A federal override? For what? Within seconds, the courthouse's emergency broadcast system buzzed to life. The speakers crackled, drawing the attention of every clerk, officer, and bystander in the building. Then the voice returned, this time louder, carried through the public address system. "Whiskey Hotel 2, this is Command Actual. Pentagon authorization confirmed. This is your reinstatement call. All prior deactivation orders rescinded. Clearance status restored to active. Acknowledge receipt." People stared at the speakers, confused, whispering. Bryce's brow furrowed. It made no sense. Emma, standing at the clerk's desk, knew exactly what was happening. Across the street, Walter sat in his truck, listening, unmoving. The call came again. "This is a direct order from the Office of Special Operations. Your badge remains active under legacy protocols. Your service is not forgotten." Silence. Then, finally, Walter pressed the receiver. His voice, low and steady, cut through the static. "Copy. This is Whiskey Hotel 2. I hear you." The response from command came immediately, resolute. "Welcome back, operator." Walter closed his eyes, a quiet breath leaving him, a breath that had been waiting to exhale for decades. And in the courthouse, Bryce's smirk vanished as the weight of what he'd done began to settle in. Bryce's pulse quickened as the final words echoed over the courthouse speakers. He turned to his fellow officers, expecting someone, anyone, to explain what just happened. But they were as stunned as he was, their radios still hissing from the override, faces pale and uncertain. "What the hell was that?" Bryce muttered, trying to force a laugh, but it caught in his throat. No one laughed with him. The realization crept over him like ice. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't a prank. Someone had just called a reinstatement order from the Pentagon. Live. Public. And it had been answered. Emma quietly stepped past him, her eyes set, her pace deliberate. Without a word, she crossed the street and found Walter still sitting in his truck, the radio now silent, the air around him still, like the calm that follows a distant thunder. Walter glanced at her, the faintest trace of a tired smile on his face. Emma hesitated, her voice soft. "They found you." Walter's hands remained on the steering wheel. He didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. "I wasn't hiding," he said eventually. "Just finished." Emma's throat tightened. "Why now? Why answer the call?" Walter looked out toward the horizon, his gaze stretching far beyond the town, beyond the years that had settled on his shoulders. "Because the call wasn't for me. It was for the men I left behind. For what we built. If they remembered, maybe it means some things we did still mattered." Emma swallowed, feeling the gravity of his words settle inside her. Across the street, Bryce finally stirred from his shock and stormed toward them, trying to reassert himself, still clinging to the need to understand. "Wait, what was that? Who called you? What does that badge even mean?" Walter stepped out of his truck, his movement slow but steady, his presence suddenly larger than life. Bryce planted himself in front of him, forcing bravado into his tone. "You can't just walk around here pretending to be something you're not." Walter met his gaze, not with anger, but with a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I never pretended." Bryce's voice wavered, his words falling apart. "Then why don't people know who you are?" Walter adjusted the badge around his neck, the sunlight catching its worn edges. "Because the ones who needed to know already did." For the first time, Bryce had no response. Emma broke the silence. The call was public. The Pentagon made sure of it. Walter's eyes softened. That wasn't for me. That was for him. So he'd understand what he just dismissed. Bryce's cheeks burned. His authority, his control, both quietly dismantled in front of the townspeople now gathering, whispering, realizing that the man they'd overlooked wasn't just another elderly vet in a small town. He was something much rarer, a living legacy. Bryce took a step back, his mind scrambling to piece together how easily he'd misjudged a man who never once raised his voice. Walter offered no further explanation. No speeches. No demands. Just a presence. And sometimes, That's more than enough. Word traveled fast in Fairview. By noon, the story had left the courthouse, crossed cafe counters, drifted through shop doorways, and settled in whispered conversations along the sidewalks. The story was simple. The Pentagon had called a man that nobody knew, and he had answered. Walter, as usual, didn't chase the attention. He drove to the edge of town, where the woods thickened, where the roads narrowed into gravel paths, and where no one would find him unless they were truly looking. But back in town, people began to look differently at the spaces he'd quietly occupied for years. The diner where he ordered the same black coffee every morning. The fishing pier where he sat for hours, staring into the water. The hardware store where the owner always gave him a veteran's discount, even though Walter never asked. Emma found herself answering questions she barely knew how to process. Colleagues asked her what she knew. Locals asked what they should do now. Even the police chief, a man known for staying out of courthouse politics, wanted to know the details. But Emma told them only what mattered. He never asked for respect, but it's long past time we gave it. Bryce, on the other hand, found no comfort in the spreading whispers. Every conversation around him felt sharp, edged with disapproval he couldn't outrun. He'd expected the story to dissolve. He'd expected the moment to pass like so many others. Instead, he was the one dissolving. At the station, his captain called him in. You crossed a line, Bryce. And not just with a citizen. You crossed it with someone the Pentagon just publicly reinstated. Bryce's confidence faltered. How was I supposed to know? He looked. Exactly. The captain's voice cut him off like a blade. You didn't know? Because you didn't see him. Bryce left the office with his shoulders hunched, the weight of his mistake pressing harder with every step. Out near the woods, Walter stood by a quiet lake, the badge resting against his chest. He traced its worn edges with his thumb, remembering hands, calloused hands, that once clasped his shoulder in dark places. Names long gone now. Friends who didn't make it. His radio buzzed softly. The voice returned, calm and steady. Whiskey Hotel 2, you are on standby. No further action required. Status, honorary active. Walter allowed himself the smallest smile. It wasn't about being called back. It wasn't about returning to the fight. It was about being remembered. He pressed the receiver. Understood. I'll stay on this frequency. Just in case. The line stayed open for a moment longer, as if giving him room to say more. But Walter was a man of few words. He clipped the radio to his belt and walked toward the tree line, where the sun painted long, golden shadows across the earth. He wasn't chasing the past, but if it ever called again, he would be ready. Bryce Holden couldn't escape the silence. It followed him through the hallways of the station, clung to him during patrols, and echoed in the awkward glances from fellow officers who had stopped laughing at his story. His mistake wasn't just public, it had been broadcast. Worse, he knew the man he'd dismissed would never come after him. There would be no confrontation, no shouting match, no opportunity to redeem himself in some clean, cinematic way. Walter Hayes didn't need to raise his voice. His silence had already judged him. Bryce sat in his patrol car that evening, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, his police radio buzzing with the usual dispatch chatter. But the weight in his chest didn't come from the job. It came from the realization that he'd spent years enforcing rules without ever really learning the people behind them. He thought about the way Walter had looked at him, not with hatred, but with the distant patience of a man who'd outlived too many battles to bother with small ones. Bryce's eyes flicked to the passenger seat, where the citation folder sat untouched. Inside, on top, was the ticket he'd written for Walter's truck. He tore it in half. Something in him wouldn't let that paper stay whole. Bryce didn't know what he was chasing as he drove to the edge of town. Maybe it was forgiveness. Maybe it was clarity. Maybe it was the chance to prove to himself that he could still do something right. He found Walter by the lake, exactly where Emma had guessed he'd be. The air was thick with the scent of pine and cold water. The world out here moved slower, and Bryce suddenly felt out of place in his crisp uniform and polished badge. Walter heard him approach, but didn't turn. "You're a hard man to find," Bryce said, his voice lower than usual, the edges stripped of bravado. Walter kept his gaze on the water. "I'm not hiding. I'm just not where you usually look." Bryce shifted, unsure of himself in a way he hadn't felt since academy training. "I didn't know what that badge meant." Walter finally turned, his face calm but firm. "You didn't ask." The simplicity of it stung. Bryce lowered his eyes, words failing him. I've made a career out of enforcing rules, Bryce admitted, his throat tightening. But I didn't see you. I didn't even try. And I've realized I've probably missed a lot more than just you. Walter studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke, carefully. Respect isn't about a badge. Not yours. Not mine. It's about how you carry yourself when no one's looking. Bryce nodded slowly, absorbing it. I don't expect you to salute me, Walter added quietly. But I do expect you to see the people you're sworn to protect. Even the ones you think don't matter. Bryce's voice faltered. I'm sorry. Walter gave the faintest nod. Good. Now do better. There was no grand forgiveness. No handshake. No cinematic swell of music. Just a man offering a path forward, and another who had to choose whether to walk it. Bryce turned back toward his cruiser, the weight still heavy, but the direction finally clear. Walter remained by the lake, the sun dipping lower, the ripples spreading quietly at his feet. Some lessons didn't need to be loud. Some reckonings didn't need to leave scars. Sometimes, the quiet was enough. The next day, the story officially left Fairview. The Pentagon never made a formal press release. Men like Walter didn't warrant headlines in their world. But the frequency call had been public, and that was all it took. A handful of retired operators, commanders, and quiet professionals across the country heard it. Some recognized the call sign. Others remembered the badge. For those who'd served in the shadows, the name Whiskey Hotel 2 still carried weight, even if the world had forgotten. Old phones began to ring. Quiet conversations unfolded in distant corners, coffee shops, garages, fishing boats. Men with old wounds and sharp memories asking the same question. Is he really still out there? One such man was Colonel Mason Reed, Walter's former commanding officer, a figure long retired but not yet willing to fade. When Mason heard the call sign, he stood frozen in his kitchen, his coffee going cold in his hand. He hadn't heard Walter's voice in over 30 years. The last time had been in the debris-strewn aftermath of a mission that should have ended them both. Without hesitation, Mason made his own call, one that bypassed bureaucracy and protocol. When the Pentagon liaison answered, Mason's voice was direct. Put me on the next line to Whiskey Hotel 2. No filters. The response was hesitant. Sir, Operator Hayes has not fully re-engaged. Patch me through. Mason cut in. I'm not asking. Minutes later, as Walter sat quietly on the fishing pier, his radio buzzed again. This time with a frequency only a handful of men could still reach. Whiskey Hotel 2, this is Sierra Actual. Do you copy? Walter paused, the name hitting him with an ache he didn't know he still carried. Sierra Actual, Walter said slowly. You're supposed to be on a golf course. Mason's rough laugh crackled through the line. I was. But you don't get to come back from the dead without me noticing. Walter's lips tugged into a quiet smile. Didn't come back. I just never left. Yeah, well, some of us have been waiting a long time for you to say something. Mason's voice softened. They're going to try to pull you back in, Walt. They're going to remember just enough to make you useful again. I'm not going back, Walter said firmly. I know. Mason paused. But it's good to hear your voice. They sat in the silence, the kind between men who'd crossed through hell and come out scarred but breathing. You were the best of us, Walt. You always were, Mason added. Walter's grip on the receiver tightened, his throat thickening. I was just the one who made it home. Mason didn't argue. He just let the words settle. Before ending the call, Mason offered one final piece of advice. You can stay invisible if you want. But Fairview knows now. The question is, what are you going to do with that? Walter stared out over the water, the sun glinting off the surface like scattered metals. I'm going to finish what I started. And this time, he didn't mean war. He meant the unfinished promises to the people who needed him now. Not as a soldier, but as something far rarer. A man who stayed. Walter woke before dawn, long before the town stirred. The sky was still a deep navy blue, with the faintest traces of pale light creeping over the horizon. The world was wrapped in a quiet stillness, the kind of silence that invites reflection and stirs memories too heavy for the daylight. He sat on his weathered porch, the old wooden boards creaking softly beneath him. In his hands was a worn coffee mug, the steam rising slowly in the cool morning air. Against his chest, beneath the fabric of his jacket, lay the badge, the tarnished, chipped insignia that had become his tether to a past most had tried to forget. It felt heavier now, not just with metal, but with meaning. The mornings had changed over the years. Once, Before the weight of loss and time settled on his shoulders, they were filled with plans, maps spread out under harsh lights, hushed conversations over radio static, coordinates etched into his mind. Now, the mornings were quieter, but no less important. Walter's thoughts drifted back to the courthouse, to the moment Patrolman Bryce Holden had sneered at him, laughing at the badge he wore. It wasn't the disrespect that had cut deepest, it was the invisibility. The feeling that decades of sacrifice had been erased, reduced to a joke by someone who'd never seen the true cost. Yet, that moment had also sparked something. The call from the Pentagon had been more than a reinstatement. It was a reminder. A reminder that some debts never expire, some promises live beyond time and circumstance. Walter looked out at Fairview as the first signs of life appeared. Cars rolling down Main Street, the diner's neon sign flickering on, and neighbors greeting one another with quiet smiles. These were the people he protected, though most never knew his name or story. He remembered a conversation from years before, when his daughter had asked why he never spoke about the war. "I don't tell stories to be heard," he'd said softly. "Some battles live inside you, and their weight shapes who you become." He took a long sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through him, steadying his soul. He was no longer the young man who'd charged into unknown dangers. Time had marked him with scars, some visible, many not. But it had also gifted him something rare: perspective, humility, and a quiet strength. Carefully, Walter folded the badge into the pocket of his jacket. There would be no parades, no public ceremonies. The world might never fully understand what he had done or why he had disappeared. But that didn't matter anymore. Respect wasn't something to be demanded or expected. It was earned in the silence, in the moments when no one was watching. With a deep breath, Walter rose, the morning sun now spilling fully over the horizon, bathing the town in golden light. He stepped down from the porch and walked toward the day ahead, ready to carry his legacy not with fanfare, but with the dignity that had defined his life all along. Because some men don't just serve once. They carry their service with them, every step of the way. News of Walter's reinstatement call had slowly but steadily seeped into the fabric of Fairview. It wasn't announced in city newspapers or broadcast on national news, but it quietly altered how the townspeople viewed their most unassuming neighbor. The story didn't shout, it whispered, and in that whisper lay its power. At the local diner, where Walter had been a fixture for years, the usual hum of conversation softened the moment he stepped inside. The clatter of coffee cups slowed. Conversations paused, not out of obligation or curiosity, but out of a growing respect. The waitress, a woman who had seen Walter come and go without ever speaking more than a few words, poured his coffee without being asked, placing it carefully on the worn wooden table he always chose near the window. There were no intrusive questions, no small talk, just a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted. Even the children began to notice. Those same kids who once ignored the quiet, silver-haired man sitting alone on the park bench now edged closer with wide eyes, asking soft questions to their parents about who he was. The answers were whispered in tones that spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and quiet strength, the kind of stories children heard only once in a while, and only from those who had witnessed history firsthand. Emma observed these changes with a quiet satisfaction. As a courthouse clerk, she often saw Walter going about his business, rarely interacting, always modest. Now, she watched the subtle nods and smiles from neighbors, the way strangers held doors open a little longer, the way conversations paused when he entered a room. It was as if the town collectively realized that Walter had been there all along, unseen, unacknowledged, but never forgotten. One afternoon, a small group gathered at the community center, not officials, not press, but neighbors. They came to express a gratitude that had long been withheld. Walter arrived with his old badge pinned quietly to his jacket. There were no speeches or grand ceremonies, just gentle handshakes, heartfelt thanks, and a few warm smiles that carried years of respect in their depth. A young boy approached Walter and handed him a simple drawing, a soldier standing tall beneath a waving flag. Walter accepted it, his eyes misting slightly. He knelt and nodded at the boy, their exchange heavy with unspoken understanding. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Walter stood on the edge of town, gazing out over the fields that had been his refuge for so long. He thought of the friends he'd lost, the battles that lived inside him, and the quiet life he was rebuilding. He knew the road ahead would hold challenges, not the kind fought with weapons or orders, but those of presence, healing, and belonging. For the first time in a long while, Walter felt truly seen. Not because of the badge, or the missions, or the Pentagon's call, but for the man who carried them both, with quiet dignity and unyielding strength. The sun was dipping low behind the rolling hills as Walter finally stepped into the town's modest museum, something he hadn't done in years. For a long time, the museum had felt like a place for other people, those who celebrated history with loud ceremonies, polished medals, and framed portraits. Walter never saw himself as one of those men. His service had been quiet, hidden in shadows, far from public recognition. But today, that distance between him and the past felt smaller. Emma, who had insisted on accompanying him, walked quietly by his side. Her presence was gentle but firm, a reminder that sometimes facing the past was necessary, not for glory, but for healing. Inside, the museum smelled of aged paper, varnished wood, and memories preserved in time. The dim light softened the edges of faded photographs and carefully arranged uniforms. It was a sanctuary for stories, many untold, many forgotten. At the center of the newest exhibit was a glass case displaying an array of badges, medals, and worn patches. Walter's eyes immediately found the badge pinned inside, the very one he wore each day beneath his jacket, the badge that had been a source of quiet pride and sorrow. Beside it, a polished plaque detailed the history of an elite unit. Men who had operated in silence and secrecy, men whose names rarely appeared in the news, but whose sacrifices were immeasurable. Walter's breath caught. He traced the outline of the badge in the glass with his eyes, feeling decades of memories flood back. The camaraderie, the loss, the missions that never made it to the headlines. Next to the badge were photographs. Young men in fatigues, faces determined and hopeful, standing shoulder to shoulder. Letters from commanders praised their valor and precision. Testimonials spoke of lives saved and battles ended before they began. Emma stood quietly beside him, sensing the shift inside the man who had carried so much alone. "This is your story, Walter," she said softly. "Not just the badge or the missions, but the man behind it." Walter's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "It's more than I ever thought I deserved." Then a voice broke the stillness. A middle-aged man, carrying the unmistakable bearing of a soldier, approached. Walter didn't immediately recognize him, but when the man extended a hand and said with a warm smile, "Colonel Mason Reed," the past settled around them like a familiar cloak. Mason's eyes held the weight of shared history. "I came as soon as I heard. It's about time you came home." The two men stood together in that quiet space, a living link between past and present, between silence and remembrance. Walter realized then that his legacy wasn't a burden but a beacon, a testament to the strength of service carried not for recognition, but for the people who still needed him. As the museum lights dimmed and the last visitors departed, Walter felt a profound peace settle over him. For the first time in a long time, he was truly seen. Walter's return to his quiet life in Fairview was soon accompanied by an unexpected visitor, his son, Mark. For years, the distance between them had stretched wide and cold, filled with unspoken words and the invisible scars that come from silence. Their relationship had become a fragile thing, held together by the barest threads of memory and longing. Now, in the modest kitchen of Walter's small home, Mark stood across from the man who had seemed a stranger for so long, not just physically, but in spirit. The silence between them was thick, but beneath it lay something waiting to be uncovered. Mark's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I didn't understand before, not the things you did, not why you never talked about any of it. I thought you were just broken." Walter's eyes softened, a deep sadness hidden behind the resilience that had carried him through decades. "I wasn't broken, just carrying a weight too heavy to share. Some battles stay with you, no matter how far you run. I kept it from you because I didn't want you to carry it too." Mark swallowed hard, the emotions tightening his throat. "I've been hearing the stories now. About the call from the Pentagon, the badge. I'm proud of you, Dad. More than I ever found the words to say when I was younger." Walter reached across the table and placed a steady hand on Mark's shoulder. "Pride isn't about medals or recognition or the missions no one knows about. It's about knowing what you did mattered, even if the world forgot. You carry that, too, whether you realize it or not. The years of silence began to dissolve between them, folding gently into a quiet understanding. Mark saw the man behind the stories, the father who had protected his family not with words, but with the steady presence of someone who bore the scars of service silently. For the first time in a long time, the two sat together without the weight of the past pressing down. The gaps between them started to close, healed by honesty and the fragile hope of reconciliation. Mark's visit wasn't just a fleeting moment. It marked the beginning of a new chapter. For Walter, it was a chance to reclaim a part of himself long lost to duty and pain. For Mark, it was an opportunity to understand the man who had sacrificed so much, quietly, without expectation. As night settled outside the window, Walter felt a truth rise quietly within him. The greatest battles often happen at home, in forgiveness, in connection, and in the courage to bridge the silence. Some legacies, no matter how quiet or unassuming, are meant not just to be remembered, but to heal. In the weeks that followed Mark's visit, Walter found himself facing a new kind of battle, one that was fought not with weapons or tactics, but with vulnerability, patience, and the slow work of healing. The quiet fortress he had spent decades building around himself, the one that shielded him from the world, began to show cracks, revealing memories long buried and emotions carefully locked away. Walter maintained his familiar routines, waking before dawn, sitting on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee, and wandering the quiet paths outside Fairview. But beneath those steady habits, something had shifted. There was an undercurrent of change, a soft unraveling that made space for things he had pushed aside for too long. He began opening up, first in small ways, with Emma and a few trusted friends in town. He didn't speak of battles or missions or medals. Those were stories for another time, if ever. Instead, he shared fleeting moments, a scar that flared painfully with the rain, a song from the radio that stirred memories of fallen brothers, the weight of countless nights spent staring into darkness. These weren't tales of glory, but fragments of a life shaped by service and loss. Walter never sought sympathy. What he wanted was understanding, quiet, steady recognition of the invisible wounds that never healed. At the local veterans group, Walter's presence became a quiet anchor. Men and women who had faced their own internal wars recognized the depth behind his silence. They shared stories, not for attention, but to unburden the heavy weight of memory. Walter listened more than he spoke, offering nods and quiet affirmations. When he did share, his words carried the full weight of lived experience. Never boastful, always measured with the care of someone who knew the price of every word. Mark, too, began to join these gatherings. He saw firsthand the complexity of his father's world and the community of veterans who understood what it meant to carry invisible scars. The distance between father and son slowly shrank in the company of those who knew the cost of service. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of amber and deep blue, Walter and Mark sat side by side on the porch. The air was heavy with unspoken thoughts, with the quiet tension of past wounds. "Dad," Mark began, his voice tentative, "I want to understand. All of it. The good, the bad, the parts you never told me." Walter looked at his son, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and guarded hope in his eyes. "It's a long road, son. Some parts are harder to carry than others. But I'll tell you what I can, when you're ready." They sat together in silence, not needing words to mark the moment. The healing had begun, not with grand declarations or sudden breakthroughs, but in the simple act of presence, of shared space and trust. Walter's battle wasn't over. He knew that. But for the first time in a long time, he was no longer fighting it alone. Word of Walter's story had slowly but surely spread beyond the quiet streets of Fairview, weaving its way into the hearts of many who never imagined a man like him still walked among them. His story was not one of explosive headlines or battlefield glory, but a quiet testament to resilience, humility, and the unspoken sacrifices so many veterans bore alone. For countless others who had felt invisible, dismissed, or forgotten, Walter's journey became a beacon, a subtle reminder that honor could be reclaimed, even after years in the shadows. At the local community center, a meeting was called, not by government officials or grand organizers, but by veterans, families, and neighbors who understood the profound weight carried by those who had served in silence. It was a gathering born from respect and empathy, a space where stories like Walter's could be heard, acknowledged, and honored without fanfare. Walter arrived with Emma and Mark quietly at his side. The years of memory, sacrifice, and unspoken pain settled gently on his broad shoulders. He moved through the room with the modesty of a man who had long avoided the spotlight, yet his presence commanded quiet attention. The room was filled with faces of men and women, some with visible scars, many with invisible ones. People who had lived through battles both external and internal. Veterans who had returned home to towns like Fairview and found themselves forgotten or misunderstood. Families who had loved in silence, while their heroes carried burdens too heavy to share. Walter spoke little at first, allowing the room to absorb his presence. When he did finally speak, his voice was soft but steady, carrying the weight of lived experience. "We all carry burdens," he said simply. "Some are visible, many are not. But every story matters. Every sacrifice, every moment of courage, every night spent awake because the world felt too heavy, that all matters." His words hung in the air, a solemn reminder that heroism was not measured in medals or parades, but in the quiet endurance of those who kept moving forward when no one was watching. As the meeting ended, conversation spilled outside into the cool evening air. Veterans exchanged stories, families offered support, and a community began to knit itself tighter around those who had given so much. It was a beginning, not a grand finale. Walter watched from a distance as Mark engaged with other veterans, sharing laughs, nodding knowingly, the gap between father and son continuing to close through shared understanding. The younger man had grown in ways Walter hadn't dared hope, learning what it truly meant to carry a legacy. The ripple effect of Walter's story was just beginning. It wasn't about fame or glory, nor was it a call to arms. It was about recognition, about healing, about the profound power of presence and understanding. In that moment, Walter found a new mission, not on distant battlefields or in secret operations, but right here at home, among the people who had finally come to see him, not just as a veteran, but as a man who had given everything quietly, patiently, and with immeasurable strength. And as the stars began to appear overhead, Walter knew this was just the start of something far greater. A community awakened to the true cost of service, and a future where no veteran would feel invisible again. The night air hung cool and still, a gentle breeze rustling through the trees as Walter stood quietly outside his small home on the outskirts of Fairview. Above, the stars blinked faintly through scattered clouds, as if bearing silent witness to the weight of a life spent in service, silent sacrifices woven into the fabric of his being. The journey that had begun with pain and invisibility was now drawing to a close, but not with fireworks or grand applause. Instead, it closed with a solemn dignity that had been his constant companion. Nearby, Emma and Mark stood by his side, their presence a quiet circle of support and love. Their steadying hands and gentle smiles were the anchor Walter needed, the family that had been tested by years of silence and distance, but ultimately strengthened by understanding and truth. The small gestures of the community, the nods of respect at the diner, the quiet thank yous from neighbors, the veterans group gatherings, had blossomed into something far deeper than Walter could have imagined. It was a web of connection, binding him not only to those who knew the weight of his service, but to a new generation learning the true meaning of sacrifice. Walter's mind drifted to the men and women who had never returned from battlefields far from this quiet town, the brothers and sisters in arms whose faces were etched clearly in his memory. Their stories were stitched into the core of who he was, a living testament that echoed in the quiet moments between day and night. This, he thought, was the true honor he carried now, not a medal pinned to his chest, nor the recognition of a distant world, but the memory of those who had given everything. Their legacy was the fire that kept him going, the promise he had made to keep their sacrifices alive. His fingers brushed against the worn badge tucked inside his jacket pocket, the badge that had once been laughed at, dismissed as obsolete. Now, it felt heavier than ever, not because of the medal itself, but because of what it represented: resilience, humility, truth, and the unyielding strength of a man who had never stopped fighting for what mattered. Walter spoke softly to himself, his voice almost a whisper carried by the night breeze. It's not about being remembered by the world. It's about living a life worthy of the memories we carry. That's the real measure of honor. He reflected on how far he had come, from obscurity and dismissal to a place of recognition and connection. Yet, the real victory wasn't in headlines or accolades. It was quieter, more profound. It was the reclamation of dignity that had been denied for so long, the healing of wounds invisible to most, and the shaping of a future grounded in respect, understanding, and compassion. As the first light of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of pink and gold, Walter's gaze swept over the town he had always protected, sometimes in the shadows, sometimes in silence, but always with unwavering dedication. This place, these people, had become more than just a home. They were the heart of his renewed purpose. He knew his story was but one among many, quiet heroes who walked among us, bearing invisible scars and unspoken histories. Men and women who carried burdens few could understand, yet whose courage shaped the very fabric of our world. And in that knowledge, Walter found a peace he had not known in decades. The badge, once scorned as obsolete, had reclaimed its meaning. To those who mattered, the men he served beside, the family he loved, the community that had embraced him, Walter Hayes would forever be a man of honor, a guardian whose strength endured beyond the battlefield. His journey was complete, not with fanfare, but with the lasting dignity of a life well lived. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive tactical stories.